So this has been a year for late frosts. After having, really warm conditions, we had a kind of sharp frost in April, followed by another one this past week. And we're seeing, a lot of impacts on some of our landscape trees, and it might look bad, but it's unlikely to kill or cause long-term damage to your trees, whether they're in the forest or the landscape setting. Now, what you will see is those newly emerging leaves and especially buds or flowers becoming kind of limp and wilted as soon as that freeze comes through, then browning and falling off. This also might result in some misshapen leaves. So you might not notice it until they expand a little bit more, but you might see some holes or some crumpling in those leaves. The species that are most impacted are going to depend on where you're living and what was leafing out in your area during this freeze, or maybe just getting ready to bloom. But I've seen a lot of damage on yellow poplar, redbud, yellowwood, pawpaw, coffee tree. In that first freeze that we had. Most recently, this one that we just had this week, I would expect to also be seeing some damage on hickory and maybe oak, as well as the other species that I mentioned. So the overstory tends to protect seedlings and saplings from this damage, and they're the most susceptible ones to frost damage. So you'd expect to see the worst damage in exposed settings, like landscapes, or seedlings regenerating in a recently cleared area or a reforested site. But you can even see some in the woods. So you might see a frost line, a distinct line of dead tree leaves, likely a particular tree species just leafing out when the cold hit. So the damage might look severe, but plants will usually recover and just send out another flush of leaves. If that terminal bud is killed, the one on the very tip, some of those axillary buds will grow, and soon you won't even be able to tell. But this is another stress to those species. And this isn't the only weather-related stress trees have had to deal with recently. Think back to last fall, how it was warm for a long time, and then all of a sudden we had a cold snap when trees weren't into dormancy yet. That can cause some damage. Before that, the drought that we had last summer, the extreme wet weather that we had before that. So all of these things can add together to really be a stress on trees. So I'd expect in the next few years that we'll see, more decline of trees. We'll see some of those opportunistic insects and diseases popping up that are associated with tree stress. Things like hypoxylin canker, ambrosia beetle, two-line chestnut borer. So something to keep an eye out for the next few years. And while in the forest and landscape setting, the damage from this frost to trees is likely to be temporary and minimal, in orchard settings, things have been much more severe. So not to downplay what's been happening there. So another kind of impact in forests that we might see from this is, the most susceptible tissue in a lot of these cases is buds and flowers. And if those are killed from the frost, we'd expect to see really low fruit set from things like pawpaw. I know that a lot of pawpaws were blooming right when that first freeze hit, and then those flowers died, so we won't expect to see much fruit this year. The same thing's true with other species. So years with late freezes like this are associated with low acorn production. So that could have implications for wildlife, as well as any plans, if you have plans to collect seeds or fruit this year. So I'm sitting here with one of my favorite landscape trees that I think is underused. This is yellowwood, and it's got a beautiful form, a kind of smaller tree, really nice flowers. But as you can see, this tree looks a little bit fried. We've got dead leaves here, but also the tree is responding by putting on new growth. And I don't anticipate long-term there's going to be a major negative impact to most of our native forest trees because of this. However, combined with the drought that we had last summer, as well as the cold snap that we had last November after it had been warm for a long time and trees hadn't entered dormancy, and then now another cold snap this spring, all of those things can really add up over time, especially with a tree like this, recently planted. Something you're going to want to think about, how can you promote the health of those trees as much as possible to prevent any long-term damage.